I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the show, I want to remind you that I need your help to keep this show going. I'm going to be releasing a lot more content in the coming weeks and months ahead, and no doubt the next 4 years. It's going to be a wild ride, folks, and I need your help. Support me on patreon.com/parallaxviews. You are getting all these shows for free. I don't like paywall in the content, so I need you to support the show out of the kindness of your heart. If you appreciate the information that I am trying to get out there, the perspectives I'm trying to get out there, whether it's from the left or the right, I'm trying to give you an idea of what is going on in the world, the different perspectives with regards to politics, culture, etc. I really, really hope that if you appreciate all that, what I am putting out there into the world, into the ether, that you will support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Now, another thing I want to know. I had someone complain recently about a guest saying too much on an episode. And the thing you have to realize is these shows are very, very lightly edited. And the conversations are not canned conversations where you have, a series of questions that were written up beforehand. This is like a dialogue you're hearing between two people, usually. Sometimes we have a third guest, we do panel shows occasionally, but you're hearing like pretty raw conversation. There's going to be ums and uhs once in a while. Just is the way it is. Now, with all that out of the way, I've got a guest for you. The nation's Jeet Heer returns to discuss a number of topics related to the 2024 election with a special focus on the failure of centrist Democrats in this definitively anti-system politics moment. We'll also discuss Trump's shock and awe strategy, Mafia governance, and the illusion, or the mirage, if you will, of MAGA's anti-war politics. That's not to say that every faction of MAGA is faking anti-interventionism, but I think you'll see what we mean in the conversation to follow. There's a lot of elements of MAGA that may be anti-interventionist on one thing, but, maybe they're more hawkish in another area. There's really a lot to chew on in this conversation. So, without any further ado, let's get right to it with Jeet Heer. I want to welcome back to Parallax Views a guest that I've been wanting to have on to talk about comic books, because he, is a comics critic, but unfortunately we have to talk about something maybe a bit more pertinent right now. Jeet Heer is a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and host of The Nation's weekly podcast, The Time of Monsters. And boy, has he been busy. He has, four different articles out since the election, and they're all really pertinent. Jeet, I want to ask you first, how are you doing? It's some dark times we're living in. Time of monsters, if you will.
Yeah, no, no. Well, precisely because my show is called The Time of Monsters, and it's as some listeners will know, this is a quote or paraphrase from the great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. I'm perhaps a little bit better geared than a lot of people are because I have always accepted Gramsci's analysis of the sort of interwar crisis of the 1920s and 30s, which is that if you have a regime that has lost its legitimacy, where the ruling elite no longer has hegemony, and therefore the population is up for grabs, you will see a rise of charismatic leaders who rely on violence. As you said, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And I've always felt that that applies to the current moment, that after the failure of the Iraq War and the 2008 economic meltdown, and now after COVID, there's a loss of hegemonic legitimacy. There's deep anti-systems politics that's emerged of that is precisely where monsters like Donald Trump flourish. So while there's a close election, and I had been hopeful that Kamala Harris was going to be able to cobble it together, it's not totally unsurprising that Trump won. I mean, let's put it this way: you've had three close elections in a row. Because the 2016, because of the Electoral College, Trump basically won by 75,000 votes in three states. In 2020, and I think people don't know this, despite an overwhelming popular vote victory, Joe Biden only won by around 45,000 votes in three states. Otherwise, the election would have been thrown to the House and would have gone to Trump. And this time it's like 150,000 votes in three states. Again, given the size of the states, that's a pretty, it's a shift of just a few points. Would have actually given us a reverse 2016 with Kamala Harris losing the popular vote, but winning the Electoral College. So three elections in a row, two settled for Trump, but all the same election, really, which is that you each time you had a candidate who was a pro-systems candidate that wants to, preserve the existing order with reforms, and Trump running as the anti-system candidates. And two times out of three, the anti-system politician won.
Well, I think that's a good lead in to two articles she wrote immediately after the election. The first was This Time We Have to Hold the Democratic Party Elite Responsible for This Catastrophe. And the second one was Bernie Sanders is right. Democrats have abandoned the working class. And I'm glad you mentioned the '08 crisis, COVID, and of course, the war on terror years, because I do think that all plays a role in this. There's been this long shadow, and I do think there has been this abandonment of the working class that the Democratic Party hasn't reckoned with. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, if you want to take a long structural view of this crisis, there had been a period after the Cold War and leading to the early days of 9/11 and the war on terror, where there was a kind of basic center right, center left consensus, which is American global hegemony, upholding a system of finance capital that both had great inequality, but provided enough credit to allow the working class some room to maneuver. Both the sort of failure of the war in Iraq and then the 2008 meltdown discredited that coalition. And since that period, I'd say roughly since 2005 with Katrina and afterwards, the American public has been deeply pessimistic. They have thought that the country is going on the wrong turn, and they have always supported anyone who can offer an alternative to the system. So in 2008, that was Barack Obama winning the biggest majority that we've seen in this era, running on hope and change. And in 2012, Obama was gifted with an opponent who was a Republican who wanted to return to the old order, who was basically the monopoly money man, who Obama quite correctly was able to characterize as a venture capitalist who made millions, impoverishing the Midwest. And so Obama, again, as a candidate of change, and as a candidate of no more stupid wars, won in 2012. In 2016, Hillary Clinton ran as the candidate of the establishment against the insurgent threat of, well, actually, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. First, in the primaries, Hillary used identity politics to consolidate a hold on the Democratic Party, and to basically defeat a very strong insurgency by Bernie Sanders. And usually, one would try to incorporate such a strong insurgency within the campaign and possibly offer Bernie a vice presidential ticket. That did not happen. She preferred to go with Tim Kaine. And we actually have a very interesting audio tape from Donald Trump in the summer of 2016, where he said, his greatest worry was that she would choose Bernie Sanders as vice president. And if she had done that, Trump was telling his staffers, this is an off-the-record conversation that only came out later, that, they would have won. The Democrats would have won. But so Hillary instead ran a deeply establishment campaign. She did not say, like, Trump is a plutocrat the way Mitt Romney was a plutocrat. She said Trump is not a real billionaire. We are the party of real billionaires. We have Michael Bloomberg as our guy, and we have all these military officers who say Trump is a national security threat, and trying to cast Trump as someone outside of American politics, as Putin's puppet. That failed. And Trump won as the change candidate, as a candidate who said this era of trade agreements and open immigration was destroying the working class. And he was able to really and running significantly in 2016 as an anti-war candidate, saying that he had basically lying about the fact that he had supported Bush's war in Iraq, saying that he's a different type of Republican. And Hillary Clinton in 2016 attacked Trump as not being a national security, strong on national security, as being too conciliatory towards the Palestinians. This is something that Hillary Clinton actually said at her big foreign policy speech in San Diego, that Trump was going to be too fair-minded and even-handed in the Israel-Palestine dispute. So Hillary's campaign failed. Now, in 2020, the Democrats had the advantage that now Trump was the status quo candidate, who's in charge during this moment of COVID, and had many unpopular positions, and they were able to really harness a lot of the insurgent energy in America, especially the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd uprising. Actually, just to go back to 2016, I want to underscore the anti-war point, because we have very good sort of social science data saying that in the places in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, where in rural areas where they had a large military presence, where a large number of people had gone and served and died in Iraq and Afghanistan, Trump did significantly better. And that if those places had the same death rate from wars as other areas, Hillary Clinton would have won. And Hillary Clinton was, of course, the candidate who had supported the Iraq War. But in 2020, the Democrats harnessed that, the deep feeling in America that this country is in the wrong direction. We're able to defeat Trump. But in 2024, the script flipped again. The Democrats were now the status quo, but not just the status quo. First of all, Joe Biden, both because of what was seen as his weak leadership and inflation and inability to handle immigration, but also his, obviously failing health, his visible aging, seemed like the prototype of the decrepit elite. And Democrats really have made themselves the sort of party of gerontocracy, the party of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Dianne Feinstein, and Joe Biden, of these ancient ghouls who are clinging to power at all costs, and therefore the party of the status quo. But once they switched out Joe Biden, I mean, I think the moment for change would have been Biden to have not run again, had a proper primary. They could have listened to their voters and changed. They did not do that. They switched out at the last moment. And Kamala Harris, when she just ran, first of all, she said was asked how was she going to be different than Joe Biden, and she first said they'll be I'm no different. Then but she added, well, one big difference. I'll have a Republican on my ticket. And she again ran as the Hillary campaign, which is a campaign of where the party's the status quo, a campaign deliberately targeting moderate Republicans as the voters to win over.
Liz Cheney.
We're campaigning with Liz Cheney, welcoming the endorsement of Dick Cheney, and not only just Dick Cheney, Alberto Gonzalez, the author of the torture memos. Kamala Harris cited him and welcomed his endorsement. All with the idea that if we can, and again, having Mark Cuban, former Republican billionaire, as one of her surrogates. And beyond that, because the Democrats were in the hole financially, turning to Wall Street, using her brother-in-law, Tony West, an Uber executive, to make connections to Wall Street, getting Wall Street to donors to basically gut her message. There's excellent reporting on this in the New York Times. They had a very good message on inflation, which was we're going to go after price gouging, and we will specifically go after the companies like the grocery stores that have been jacking up your prices. Wall Street did not like that. They got her to tone it down, and then she made a kind of correction to her speech. They did run some excellent ads in the swing states, and that might be why they did better in the swing states than elsewhere. But really, they did not go with the message of we're going after the price gougers. We're going after the people who are like impoverishing the working class. They went after a message of we're the party of national unity. We'll bring the sane Republicans, the good Republicans, and the Democrats together. So you're basically running as a status quo party. We are the party that will maintain American global hegemony at all cost. We'll continue the war in Ukraine. We'll continue this policy in Gaza. And again, the war issue became very significant. The New York Times reports that Trump's polling showed them that voters who were up for grabs were 6 times more likely than other voters to be concerned about Gaza. So in the last weeks of the campaign, Trump and J.D. Vance really played up the anti-war card, saying that the Biden-Harris administration were the war administration. Trump in his victory speech said, I will not start wars. I will stop wars. And again, one could say this is A, cynical, not in really keeping with who Trump is and his foreign policy. B, one should not trust that. But given the choices that voters were offering of Kamala Harris saying that she will create the fiercest fighting force that America has ever seen, and giving no indication that she was open to like a new path on Ukraine or on significantly Gaza, and not just that, but actually sending to Michigan, where there was a significant number of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans who were upset, sending there Richie Torres, one of the most vitriolic, outspoken Zionists in America, and Bill Clinton. And
Oh
Bill
my God,
Clinton,
I was gonna say, Jeet. I mean, that Bill Clinton speech where he's literally using the term Judea and Samaria in his rally
Bill
nationalist
Clinton,
term.
in that speech, blames the Arabs for what's happening in Gaza, refuses to show any like real concern for the immense suffering of what is in fact one of the most horrific slaughters of civilians that we have seen in the last 40 years, which the United Nations itself has compared to what happened in Rwanda. Bill Clinton then justifies Israel's position by citing King David and uses the phrase Judea and Samaria, which it's not even the language of liberal Zionism. This is the language of settlers on the West Bank who claim that they have a holy divine right to Palestinian lands, not just in the West Bank, but their claims are that they actually should control Gaza, they should control southern Lebanon, they should control parts of Syria and Jordan, making basically using the language of the people who are the most expansionistic colonial settlers in this conflict, a language of religious fanatics. This is the campaign that Kamala Harris ran on, and it failed. It had 2 consequences, which were predictable. One is there are really not enough moderate Republicans left anymore to win over, to bring over, right? And they might have gotten a few in here and there in some of the suburbs, but not really. B is that this alienates and demobilizes Democrats. And we're seeing not just like a flipping of votes of people to Trump, but many African Americans, Latinos, young people just stayed home. And that is this demobilization, this de-alignment, and then working class. I mean, it looks like people under 50,000 stayed at home much more than in 2020. And that Kamala Harris improved her vote share for Joe Biden among people who were 65 and older, white, and make over $100,000. That is to say, she did have some success in winning over these people, but these are a minority of people. You're basically giving up the large majority of people who are your base on behalf of a small number of people. And I should say, this is the 2016 strategy. This is Chuck Schumer in 2016 defending the Hillary Clinton campaign, before the election results were in, said that for every one blue-collar worker we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will gain 2 in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And this applies in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. And I just have to give your listeners and viewers some basic math, which is that in the United States, only a third of Americans are college educated. 2/3 are not. So if your strategy is we're going to win over college educated voters at the expense of giving up blue collar, non-college educated voters, and this was originally framed on racial terms of what, white working class, but now they're losing the Latino working class, the Asian working class, the Black working class to some degree. If that's your strategy, then you are going to lose because you're going after the smaller piece of the pie and giving up the bigger piece of the pie.
If I could interject real quick, I mean, I know what you mean by that sort of demobilization because, one of the things that actually excited me in the 4 years of the Biden presidency, and I know I'll get called an antitrust obsessive for this, as some people like to smear folks like myself on Twitter, but I was very excited about Lina Khan and even, just very specific things like the Department of Justice going after the company RealPage for algorithmic price fixing, helping landlords to basically set rents above market rates for multifamily dwellings and, colluding with these landlords to do that. DOJ was going after that under Biden, but I feel like Democrats didn't really message about that.
No, they did not message about that. And I'll go even a little bit further than that. Because I mean, Joe Biden did things for the working class. The National Labor Review Board under him was much better than it's ever been. He actually, went to a picket line. And yes, the antitrust stuff was excellent. But Kamala Harris, because of her Wall Street donors, played down all that. And in fact, there was a lot of people, including her surrogate, like Mark Cuban and others, associated with the campaign who were saying like, well, once she's in, we're really going to, not have that antitrust stuff, and we will, Lina Khan, will be out of work, and really actually going after the money of the plutocrats, going after Silicon Valley money, going after crypto money, promising as part of their program for African American men, will give insurance to crypto, like as if
Well, yeah, there was the whole thing with the Harris wanting to reset the crypto relationship, reset it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, the campaign, there's mixed messages from the campaign, and there were other people in the campaign saying, no, Khan is safe. We're sticking with her. But they did not offer a full throttle defense and use this as an argument like, we are the party that's against Wall Street. We're the party that's against corporate America. She did not run that campaign for 2 reasons. One of which is that they wanted to get those never Trump Republicans, these mythical creatures that will, and secondly, she wanted that Wall Street money. And maybe they needed that Wall Street money because, like by the time the summer came, they were really in a hole financially. They might have been able to do it. I think, hypothetically, I think they could have done a small donor campaign. There was enough excitement in the Democratic base. They could have done that, but they did not do that. They went after really the big money. And that also is a kind of a flaw to like go after donor money so much, because they had a lot more donations than Trump did, but it didn't help them because it watered down their message. So the cost of the donor money was in votes. The donor money didn't help them get votes. It cost them votes. Yeah. So I mean, this is the kind of a failed, fundamentally failed strategy that happened. Now, to be fair to Harris, she was put in there at the last minute. There are some tough choices. You could imagine a hypothetical scenario where she had been allowed, where there had been Joe Biden had stepped down, last year, the spring of last year. There's a proper primary, and either Harris or someone else could have come to the fore and could have also defined themselves more. I mean, this is the problem, that because Harris was um, has a history of flip-flopping, people didn't know who she was, and they didn't know whether she was the Kamala Harris, the centrist of 2024, or the Kamala Harris of 2019, or Kamala the cop. There's a good video of people of which there's quite a few, in Alexander Ocasio-Cortez's district, who voted both for AOC and for Trump.
Right,
And
right, where she was asking, why did you vote for Democrats
yes.
down ballot and Trump?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, and this is a video actually someone who went out and talked to people in the neighborhood. And these are, like working class people of color, Latinos and blacks. And two things that stood out is a few people mentioned, well, I don't like that she's a prosecutor. Like she went after black children for like smoking pot, and but this was part of their way of centering her as the how do you call it? The sort of centrist campaign, like 'cause she's a prosecutor, she'll go after Trump, like Law and Order. But that doesn't necessarily play well with like all the Democratic base. And second of all, a woman said something that was very interesting. She said, "Well, she's a puppet," and the interviewer asked, "A puppet of what?" And the woman said, "She's a puppet of the system." And that is the impression that Harris kind of gave, that she's a candidate that's beholden to Wall Street, that is beholden to the military-industrial complex, that is beholden to Joe Biden, a deeply unpopular president, that will not to use the words of Joe Biden, nothing will fundamentally change. And I think if you're running on a campaign of nothing will fundamentally change, when a majority of the people are unhappy, then it's a miracle they did not lose by more. And maybe a testament to how unpopular Donald Trump still is.
Amen. So it sounds like we've covered how Bernie got it right when he said that, the
Yeah,
Democratic Party needs to get back to working class politics.
yeah,
I want to
yeah.
ask you
And working
though,
class politics, I want to stress this. I think that some of the people made a mistake, that working class politics is just a matter of, we'll have the right labor laws and whatnot, right? Working class politics also means your message and your spokespeople have to be working class, that you actually have to, and you have to take a class position, and you have to name the enemies. You have to say, these are the grocery stores that are jacking up prices and they're screwing ordinary Americans. These are the credit card companies that are using usury. These are the pharmaceutical companies. There is a real refusal to name the enemy, to say that these are the people that are hurting the working class, because those are the same people that are financing the Democratic strategists and consultants. And you have Democrats, David Shore, who ran a $950 million super PAC on behalf of the Democratic Party. And to be fair, ran these ad campaigns that emphasized economic issues. He lives in, I think, a 200-foot square apartment, 200 square foot apartment in New York. And, there's like all these strategists, they get 15% of the pie, right? And this is a campaign that, if you add up the campaign and the super PACs and everything else, we're talking about, $2-3 billion. Now, tell me, what is 15% of $3 billion? We're talking about what is it, like $300 million? No, $450 million, right?
right?
Yes, $450 million went to these Democratic strategists. And they have a system where they're going to win either way, right? Because if they win, they can put that on their notch and do more campaigns. If they lose, They will blame trans people. They will blame Latino men for being insufficiently gender sensitive. They will blame Arabs for abandoning the party. And they will run on the threat of Trump, saying, because Trump will do horrible things, and they will raise money from running on Trump again. So they have, it's like the producers, you can make more money from a losing campaign than a winning campaign.
Was that a Mel Brooks reference I detected
Yes,
there?
it's from Mel Brooks'
Springtime
great
for Hitler.
movie and musical, The Producers. Yes.
So I do want to switch gears here, if you can stay a little bit longer. I really wanted to talk about this article you wrote. Donald Trump is waging a shock and awe war against his own Senate, and basically you're talking here about the strategy of Trump nominating these figures like Matt Gaetz, who is
Mm.
very unpopular even amongst a lot of
Oh yeah.
Republicans. Tulsi, of course, and also RFK Jr. What's the strategy he's working
Yeah,
here?
yeah, yeah. And there's also the defense secretary, Pete.
Hegseth.
Yeah, Hegseth. Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, there's two things. One is I think Trump really wants to show he's serious and that he's not beholden to the Republican establishment. I think the first time Trump came in with his transition team, he was a guy from New York. He didn't know people in Washington. He relied heavily on kind of like establishment advice, and got people from within the party or people like Rex Tillerson, who didn't carry out what he wanted. And I think Trump wants to show, I'm serious. I'm going to bring in my own people, which are people beyond the pale. But also, it's a kind of like cult-like litmus test, right? Like it's to show, like to humiliate the Republican Party by, like making these establishment Republican senators I vote for people they don't like, or if they don't vote for them, to have a recess of the Senate and do recess appointments, which would be run roughshod over the Constitution. And I think it's part of a larger Trump strategy. Even though they'll have a trifecta, he's going to try to rule without Congress and the Senate because he found that a problem the last time that they were kind of reluctant to do stuff that he wanted done. It was a Republican Congress, remember, that launched the RussiaGate investigation. I think Trump really wants to try to run everything out of the White House. We also see this with the Musk um, panel or entity to cut government funding, and they're trying to make a claim that they can override congressional rules about where funding has to go. So basically, to try to find these maneuvers around the checks and balances of the Constitution. But I mean, it's a dominance play, right? Like it's like I will humiliate you and make you take, like the other commonality of the cabinet positions, they're all people who have shown themselves to be servile and loyal to Trump and are dependent. Like if you're Matt Gaetz, like you don't have anything going for you other than the fact that Trump likes you, right? And you're gonna like do you will be loyal to him. And like Trump's in terms of law, Trump always says, who's my Roy Cohn? Who will be my, lawyer that will do everything I want? Well, Matt Gaetz will be his Roy Cohn.
Real quick, if I could, you even sort of see it with the transition team. He sort of
Yeah.
brought in people from the America First Policy Institute, the
Yeah.
Linda McMahons, rather than the Heritage Foundation
Mhm.
Project 2025 people, because
Mhm.
those Heritage people, they sort of sided with Ron DeSantis, so he's going
Yeah,
to go
yeah,
with
yeah,
the
yeah. Yeah,
FPI people.
they're more established. I mean, they're very right wing, but right wing in a conventional way. He wants his own people. He wants his own presidency. I think right off the gate, he's going to really try to. He believes in what he says, right? I think there's an element of cynicism to Trump, but also like he does actually believe in deportations and tariffs, and he's going to push that. And he believes in some version of the America First foreign policy. Although he did actually, yeah, I mean, the one conciliatory thing he did was to put Marco Rubio, who I think is terrible, and from my point of view, but who's beloved on Capitol Hill as a senator and will be respectable. But I mean, I think that Trump is quite serious about wanting to do recast foreign policy along an America First line. And I want to clarify for listeners because I do think Trump ran as an anti-war candidate, but his record is not anti-war. And when he was president, he took America out of the Iran nuclear deal, really did a lot of stuff that led to October 7. I mean, the sort of sidelining of the Palestinians, the sort of Abraham Accords between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but also like almost went to nuclear war with North Korea in 2017. But Trump's policy, foreign policy, will be the foreign policy of the mafia, that Trump basically sees NATO and other institutions as protection rackets. So he will go to, he's already doing this with like, telling, Vance is telling the Germans, you got to stop regulating Elon Musk, or we're not going to protect you in NATO, right? It's a nice little alliance system you have here. Be a pity if we withdrew the troops and Vladimir did our roughed you up a little bit, right? I mean, I should mention, like the left analysis of American foreign policy from someone like Noam Chomsky has always been, America is running a protection racket with these alliances to use them to both control the allies as well as control rivals. And Trump basically believes that, except he thinks it's not being run as a proper protection racket. There's too much talk of alliances and diplomacy, and he wants to just put it nakedly out there, turn the subtext into text, and to basically tell all of America allies, like if you don't give the U.S. what we want, then there's these other mafia states, China or Russia, that they'll rough you up. Like my friend Vladimir. He might do some crazy stuff. The nice little country you have here. It would be a pity if something happened to it.
I also wanted to note, it's interesting with some of his picks so far, especially Tulsi. I know a lot of people think that Tulsi is like some staunchly anti-war person, but even with her, you see that she has a lot of like Islamophobic and militarist positions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the more broad thing of the Trump's foreign policy vision, which is that it's anti-militarist to recalibrate the empire, not to do away with it, and to choose other targets. The basic thinking of people like Steve Bannon and I think Trump is that like it's stupid to fight in Europe. Like who cares who controls Ukraine? The Germans and French should deal with that. We want to fight, the war with the real enemies, which are Mexico and China. So, you have Trump people already talking about, launching strikes against the cartel, sending missiles into Mexico, but also ramping up, this great power competition against China. And this is actually a traditional Republican foreign policy that goes back decades. But historians of the early 20th century talk about the Republicans not as isolationist, but as Asialationist. That is to say, they did not want NATO. People like Robert Taft did not want to get involved with NATO. They thought, those are white countries. Let white countries fight amongst themselves. It's America's destiny is to control Latin America, manifest destiny, and the Pacific is the real American backyard. And we've got to, have American dominance against the yellow peril. So basically, going against the sort of, liberal internationalism, which is a view of democracy versus autocracy, to a sort of global race war. So I don't think that's an anti-war vision at all. I say this as someone who's very critical of, Joe Biden's, I think, failed attempt to revive American global hegemony, which is like, I think in both Europe and the Middle East is going to be increasingly precarious. And I think that to sacrifice a president on behalf of that goal seemed foolish to me.
I wanted to ask you just one or two more questions. In
Sure.
terms of Trump, who can we compare him to from the past, especially in terms of American politics? I've been saying that he sort of, in some ways, not always, reminds me of like a Boss Tweed type
Mhm.
character, Tammany Hall. But even then, there's a few differences. Who would you compare him to, though?
Well, I think Trump really comes out of the tradition of what's called the old right, which is not widely understood because our sense of conservatism is the sort of highbrow William F. Buckley, or Ronald Reagan internationalism. But there was an old right in the early 20th century of people like Father Coughlin, Joseph McCarthy, Douglas MacArthur, which was united around a few themes. One of which is it was anti-internationalist. It didn't believe in alliances. It wanted the United States to have a unilateral free hand in the world. It was extremely xenophobic. It was very protectionist. It did not believe in free trade, but wanted to use tariffs to protect American jobs and to create a kind of economy of autarky. And Yeah, I mean, I think that that is the sort of political vision or political system. You saw elements of it even in someone like Herbert Hoover, right? So I think that this kind of right-wing thinking lost out in the early Cold War because the Republicans bought into Cold War internationalism, and so you had Dwight Eisenhower rather than Robert Taft. But also, this tradition is sort of conspiratorial, believes in basically that anyone who's an advocate of internationalism is, how should one say it? Has three brackets around their names. Is a somehow subservient, is a kind of, deracinated internationalist. That's the
It's very related, I think, to like an almost John Bircher-esque
yeah, yeah.
worldview.
The Birch Society is a perfect example. And I think that there's a kind of there's a through line that runs from Father Coughlin to McCarthy to the Birchers through Trump, and I actually think that the personal connection that explains all this, aside from Trump's father, who was a kind of old right guy who might have been in the Klan in the 20s, is Roy Cohn, who was Trump's first lawyer and really a concierge. Like the kind of mafia advisor and who helped Trump out when, the family had trouble with because they didn't want to rent to black people. But who was like Roy Cohn had started his career as the first for in the Rosenberg case of making sure that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a couple who had small children, were executed by the American state, and then as a main advisor to Joseph McCarthy. And Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor. There's actually a very nice movie called The Apprentice, which I played very briefly before the election, but I'd really encourage people to see it because Roy Cohn explains so much of who Donald Trump is.
Last question here, and it's kind of a two-parter, I guess. What are your concerns with regards to, there's a lot of talk about the guardrails of democracy right now. How do you think that'll hold up against a second Trump presidency? And the second part of that is, what can voices that are anti-Trump, progressive, liberal do to resist?
Well, I think the greatest danger is that Democrats and Republicans in the elite level will go along with this. And I think Joe Scarborough's surrender to Trump is a kind of good indication of where things are going. And I think that Trump will be able to win these people over through the shared anti-Palestinian prejudice. To say that, I'm going to crack down on the Palestinians and get Democrats to sign on for anti-free speech acts of a sort of, type that we haven't seen since McCarthyism. And I think that's the great danger. And that gets to the second part, which is I think that the best thing we can do is really within the Democratic Party oppose the centrists who are going to do this and really like remind everyone it's these people that lost the election. They got the election they wanted. They got the presidency they wanted. They got Joe Biden, who did some good things on the economy, but basically ran as a foreign policy president with military Keynesianism. These people, their political project has failed, and they have to be kicked out of they have to be I would say kicked out, but let's say made junior partners in the coalition. They have to realize that their time is up. They got to do what they wanted to do, and they have failed America. They have failed the world. They are world historical failures.
And that first part of the question, how do you think the guardrails of democracy, as they're being
Well, I
called,
mean,
will
I
hold
think that
up?
the Palestinian issue will be the test run of the guardrails of democracy. I think that you will see real repression because you will get the Republicans and centrist Democrats buying into the repressive apparatus. Democrats have already signed on immigration. They said we like Trump's immigration policy. So both on immigration, deportation, and on the suppression of free speech justified on the grounds of supporting Israel. I think because Trump will get support, the guardrails of democracy will not actually hold. We will see a real erosion of democratic freedom in the United States. But the only way to oppose that is through the Democratic Party to actually make the Democratic Party know that if this is what they do, there will be political consequences for them.
Well, hey, Jeet Heer, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. What do you want to say in closing? What do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation, and how can they keep up with your work?
Oh, I'm on the Nation magazine, so and on Twitter, easy to find. I mean, I think I sort of ended on a bit of a despairing note, but I actually should say that there has been, in this era of anti-systems politics, spectacular gains made by resistant movements. And these movements have come not within the Democratic Party, but in parallel to it, and sometimes in opposition to it. The Black Lives Movement, the Me Too movement, the labor movement, these have all pushed America forward. And I think that this is where the resistance, the real resistance will come from, is in social movements. And I think we have to organize and coalesce social movements, and then, but also constantly push the Democratic Party and make sure that they understand that their failure, the rights and freedoms of the American people, the rights and freedoms of undocumented immigrants, and anti-war protesters and Palestinian Americans, these people should not. They did nothing wrong. They should not pay the price for the failure of the centrist elites that have taken America and the world to the edge of the apocalypse.
I like that you said the real resistance there. Maybe we can use that as a way to differentiate from the Liz Cheneys of the world.
Yeah. No, I mean, liberal resistance is dead, and I say thank God and good riddance.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and that you'll consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Jeet Heer. To Parallax Views with Jeet Heer.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.